So you've mentioned in a previous episode that you are a baker or you've baked before, right, Hunter? Am I
That's
getting that right?
true.
Am I remembering?
I,
Okay, so
yeah,
in
I,
keeping with our usual tradition of asking a question,
yeah.
uh, what did you use? What did you make, or what did you like to make?
So yeah, I'd like to bake. I like to cook, but I like to bake a lot as well. And I did go through a period where I was baking a lot of bread, and I still do it a little bit. I think I need to get back to that. But what I would make is basically a rustic artisan loaf, a
Mhm.
boule, excuse me. So just a big round blobby kind of loaf of bread. And
So enticing.
yeah, no, it's kind of the rustic style, right? Like, and it's white bread. I've
Mhm.
tried it with wheat flour, but I didn't like it as much. Didn't come out quite as good. And there's a lot of variables in terms of how much yeast you use and how much you need the dough, and then how long you bake it at what temperature and all those kinds of things. So it takes a lot of experimentation, but I got it down fairly well, and it was a good kind of felt like a good therapeutic thing to do as well. Sort of pounding the dough and
Mhm.
a nice ritual to engage in.
Yeah, and this wasn't made. This was like just inside your oven. This wasn't with one of those sort of fancy machines. I feel like there's like machines that you can
Yeah,
just
no,
sort of
not
pour in the
using a
ingredients
bread
and
machine for sure.
okay.
Yeah, in the oven, right?
That
There's a
takes all the magic out
recipe.
of it.
That's right. Well, I mean, it's probably great. I don't want to hold that against anybody, but yeah, there's something I think special about making it in your oven. There's a kind of a famous recipe in the United States that the New York Times, the former New York Times uh, food editor Mark Bittman wrote about, and this is something that you would make in a Dutch oven, and it would take like 18 hours to rise, but it was no need. So it was really easy. You just had to plan ahead. So I was making that for a while, and that came out pretty well. But then I was interested in making the kind that you had to knead with your hands.
Mhm.
So I came up with, I found a new recipe, and just, it's the way I kind of roll is I just work on something over and over again until it's pretty decent. So yeah, bread.
Bread. So that's what we're talking about today. Geography is bread because, well, Hunter, why are we talking about bread today?
Well, bread, I mean, it's I don't know if it's a staple, but it's a really important part of meals across the world. Not necessarily for every single culture, but most cultures have some
Mhm.
form of bread. It's involved in religious traditions. It's involved in cultural traditions. There's all kinds of expressions that we have in the English language, at least, that use the term bread that speak to beyond bread itself and talks about community and connection and food and sustenance. So it seems like a pretty good topic for a couple of geographers to talk about.
Absolutely. And more to that point, I think, for me personally, it's bread is just so incredibly good. Like I love it. I love eating it. I love having it on a lot of different aspects of food, combining it with different kinds of food. I couldn't imagine my life without food. I do remember a time in my life when there was a very crazy diet called the Atkins diet, where it was like you weren't supposed to eat bread. And this was sort of predates the time
Yeah,
when
no,
like,
that's a tough one. I think that's a tough one for me. A very famous person who loves bread is Oprah. And I remember her talking about loving bread and how it's okay to eat bread and these kinds
Mhm.
of things. And, she's a cultural force. So that had a big impact, I think.
she drew us back into the light as a society
That's right.
away from this crazy diet. Anyways, basically we're here to talk about bread. Geography is bread. This will be a 2-part episode, so we haven't done one of these in a little while. So just to let everybody here know that we're going to cover a lot of information. Bread, as you can imagine, is a really large topic, and we say this a lot, but again, this could probably be its own podcast if you really wanted to be a baking podcast or a bread podcast, something like that. There's a lot of information here that somebody can really dive deep into, and we're going to do our darn best, but everything's gonna be pretty high level.
That's right. It's still a geography podcast. And
Still
I
a
think,
geography.
like, you're right. There's got to be some fantastic baking and
Mhm.
bread podcasts out there. So we'll just do our best with the 2 episodes, which is pretty good for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And before we get into, so we're going to launch into some terminology here, but I do want to do a quick sort of call out that as Hunter and I were running through the outline, I kept mispronouncing a certain word, which is leavened, because we're going to talk a lot about leavened bread. And I kept mispronouncing it as leavened, because that's just how it sounds in my head. And I've never baked. So it was kind of an unknown word to me. So if I do mispronounce it, 100 will probably correct me, which is totally cool. But I'm also, just letting everybody know that that is an unintentional mistake.
That's a full disclosure about which one of us is into baking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. With that said, let's get into sort of our terminology, because as usual, we're going to be talking about very specific terms as we sort of run through both of these episodes today. It's always nice to just sort of level set everybody. So let's get into some bread terminology. So as I just mentioned, so this idea of leavened bread, and this is really just, as far as I can tell, and Hunter, I might pass a little bit over some of these over to you because you're probably a little more familiar with these. But as far as I could see, it's really just bread that contains a rising agent, such as yeast. Correct?
That's right. Yeah, and that's the bread that rises in the oven, and
sit in the oven, you literally see it rise. Yep.
And it rises as it's proofing, as it's as you're waiting for it to get ready to put in the oven, it starts to rise, and then it rises again in the oven. So yeah, then that's opposed to a bread that, like a flat bread that may be leavened, but oftentimes is not, and that's why it's flat.
Right, and a flatbread would be something like a pita versus leavened bread, which would be like a loaf of sourdough.
Yeah, and I think some flatbreads may be leavened to some degree, but yeah, that's a general distinction.
Okay, cool, great. And so we already mentioned another word, which was yeast, and so this is something that seems to factor into a lot of breads. It doesn't seem to necessarily be a part of every single type of bread. Again, I'm a little bit outside of my chemistry will well here, but it's just a type of fungus that's used in baking that feeds on the sugars in the dough and produces sort of carbon dioxide, gas, and alcohol, which then causes the dough to rise.
Yep. And yeast is alive, right? And so, and in some traditions of baking, yeast is, and for brewing as well, yeast is preserved, and they have a starter yeast, and that they keep dipping into that source of yeast and use it over and over again. When I don't do that when I'm baking, that would be more advanced. I mean, I use a dry yeast that I mix with warm water, and then add to the dough.
I've heard that's pretty common amongst people who bake a lot of sourdough. I don't know how correct that is, but I think that's specialized.
I think the yeast is specialized in particular, and that's part of maybe what gives the bread its flavor. But the yeast that one uses is a huge part of the bread breaking process.
Right. And so again, we mentioned this word very briefly, but there's also this fermentation process, and this is the process by which the yeast consumes the sugars to then to cause that rising effect. So you're probably more familiar with fermentation as it relates to alcohol because that's how alcohol is really made. But there's also a process here with regards to bread that obviously does not create an alcoholic bread.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then we get to a word that is the bane of so many unfortunate people. And if you're not able to eat gluten, I'm sorry, that really sucks. But gluten is a protein that's found in wheat and other grains such as rye and barley. And it's sort of kneaded in dough and forms a sort of a network that traps gas bubbles and gives the bread its structure. And so, like I had mentioned, a lot of people, have some sort of intolerance to gluten. This is pretty common.
Or some people have what's called celiac, which is more than an intolerance. It's debilitating to have gluten and can make one very sick. So, but there are breads that don't have gluten in them, and so for people who can't have gluten, there's still opportunities to have bread. And I think these have come a long way in the last several decades as the attentiveness towards food allergies has been heightened. And but gluten is part of wheat for sure, and part of traditionally wheat bread, what gives it its shape and its form.
Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot more terminology. There's a lot more words that go in with baking and bread and all this other stuff. We're not going to get into basically any more words at this point, at least not in this segment. Maybe if we cross paths with them through the episode, we'll jump back in and define them at the moment. But it can get pretty detailed.
We're a little bit more on the social sciencey side than the science side of things. So we're more apt to talk about the cultural significance and political aspects of bread than we are the science of how it's made.
Exactly. But with that said, let's talk just super high level about just some types of bread.
Okay.
Right. So we've already talked a little bit about a couple of them. But let's start with sort of the one that maybe most people who are from the United States are most commonly associated with, which is white bread.
Mhm.
And if when I say white bread, you're not immediately jumping to any sort of specific image of bread, maybe it would help if I said Wonder Bread.
Right. So this is a processed variety of white bread, but white bread can also be, um, like the kind that I make, which I'm certainly the flour is processed and everything like that, but I'm not adding preservatives and the kinds of things that we'll be talking about later in the episode.
Mhm.
And white bread is more typical to Southern Europe. So if you think about the kinds of breads that predominate in Italy or France, for example, you're thinking more along the lines of white breads.
Yeah, which would be different from the breads that would come out of sort of Northern Europe, which would
Right,
be
where
rye.
the more robust rye breads and those kinds of things, because those are the grains that grow better in the Northern European climate. And so, yeah, that's part of where the distinction comes from, is what grains predominate or do well in certain areas that are used to make bread.
Yeah, and we'll talk, like you mentioned, Hunter, we'll talk a little bit more about white bread later in the episode, or maybe in part 2 of the episode. I can't really remember at this point where it falls, but yeah, and we're going to talk about it within the sort of the more of the context of sort of the Wonder Bread-esque kind of thing, because there's a lot of certainly U.S. history that gets built into that, and sort of why our bread maybe tastes a little different from.
Wonder Bread carries a lot of cultural meaning with it.
Absolutely, yeah. But with that said, let's jump to, we already talked about rye, so let's jump to rye. So rye is made from rye flour, and this is a bread that has a slightly sour taste and a dense texture. And this can come in sort of multiple sort of different variations, including dark rye, light rye, marbled rye. I think maybe is the kind of rye that I've seen maybe the most. There's also sourdough. We've already talked a little about sourdough. This is my favorite type of bread.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love sourdough. It's basically the only bread I buy at this point.
Interesting.
Well, and I'll tell you why. It's because, well, one, I really like the taste, but I also know if I get sourdough bread, it's not going to have added sugar into it.
Okay.
Which is a very common thing in the United States. So we're going to talk a little bit about later. But this is bread that is made by fermenting dough using naturally occurring, I have here, lactobacilli and yeast. So that's some sort of agent. I'm not entirely sure of the bacteria. The result is a chewy, crusty loaf with a very distinctive sour taste. Very delicious. Yeah,
I burned out on sourdough bread when I was living in San Francisco.
Oh, yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, because we're going to talk about sourdough in San Francisco in a little bit as well. Then there's this sort of term whole grain bread. And this is just bread that's made from grains that are fully intact, including the bran, germ, and endosperm. And whole grain breads are often more nutritious than breads made with refined grains. Of course,
the nutrition hasn't been stripped down so much.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, there are always caveats, right? There's, that it's not a guarantee that if you find whole grain, it's always going to be more nutritious than something that's not whole grain. But generally, that seems to be the case. There's also not really a type of bread, but artisan bread. You talked a little bit about that as well, Hunter. This is typically handcrafted in small batches using sort of traditional methods, natural ingredients. And generally, they lack sort of the preservatives found in most commercially baked breads. And again, I've said this a lot, but we're going to talk about preservatives at some point.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. In the modern version of bread.
Exactly. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump into some of the early history of bread. And I think, well, so we covered a similar episode on beer, right? So it's a few weeks ago.
Check it out if you haven't heard it.
Check it out. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because there are some similarities between bread and beer. And so similar with beer, the exact origins of bread are a bit of a mystery. It does appear that bread and beer might have similar potential origins, but there are lots of sort of bread and bread-like foods that crop up kind of completely independent from each other, or there's just no natural link to sort of, bread popped up here, therefore it moved over to this civilization next door and then moved over to that civilization next door through a sort of a linear timeline. That doesn't appear to be the case. Now, that's not to say that's not the case, but history is history, and a lot of our history is lost. So,
Yeah, there's limits to our ability to know what goes on, but I think at least some people believe that that bread rises independently from place to place, which suggests that it's not a universal, but that it's something that a number of different groups of people have come upon and developed and made intrinsic to their diet and their culture.
yeah, and it's, maybe it's for this, reason, right? This independent sort of, bubbling up of, bread in different civilizations. Maybe it's for this reason that we kind of see different cultures and civilizations, have a lot of their own styles, flavors, types of bread that don't really match up pretty well with, again, any sort of linear pattern of, how things might have evolved. Mm-hmm. Again, this is none of this to say this is absolutely the case. It's just sort of a hypothesis and based on a sort of a lack of history that we know of. So I guess high level, I think we just want to get across that the history of bread is not really a linear history. And as we go through the history, we're going to start with some very early history that is going to be a little linear, but then very quickly we're going to jump to a bunch of different civilizations. And it's at that point that we're going to leave sort of the linear tracking of, historical time behind, because we just can't do it. Things are happening at the same time, but we don't want to, jump from India to, the Americas and to, wherever, Ethiopia, all in sort of a linear fashion. So we'll tackle each one. That said, let's first track way back in time to maybe some of the earliest origins of bread. So according to, from some research I found, according to a study published in 2010, prehistoric humans may have been eating bread as far back as 30,000 years ago. Apparently, they found some starch grains that were found on, I guess, what would be called grinding stones that suggest that prehistoric people may have consumed a type of bread somewhere around, sort of Europe today. Now, of course,
that's before agriculture was exactly. Really a thing.
Yeah, so that significantly before. So
that's right.
I think that's what leads to a lot of the questions of, okay, we found this evidence, but we don't have evidence of agriculture happening at the same time. So what's the likelihood that this actually happened? So I think there are still some questions around that, which is why this is definitely not definitive. I mean, nothing in history is definitive, but there doesn't seem to be a consensus. It's just something to sort of note here that it could be as far back as 30,000 years ago.
Okay.
But other than that, the oldest evidence of baking bread has been found in a 14,500-year-old Natufian site in Jordan's northeastern desert. And so if you recall from our beer episode, Hunter, and listener, if you haven't listened to our beer episode, once again, go back and listen to it. It's a great one. This would be the same tribe that is home to some of the earliest forms of beer that they've found as well. And so that's kind of an interesting sort of crossover between the two, because obviously, beer and bread do share a lot in common with each other. In fact, I'm sure people here have heard of what's the phrase? It's liquid bread or something like that.
Right.
And with reference to beer, of course. So I think the high point to make here is that, if this is true, again, nothing we don't know for sure, but if this is true, then with regards to beer and bread, the Natufians were clearly people that were pretty advanced in terms of nutrition. According to an article by Reuters on the subject, so it's talking about the bread itself, it's quote, the flatbread, likely unleavened and somewhat resembling pita bread, was fashioned from wild cereals such as barley, einkorn or oats, as well as tubers from an aquatic papyrus relative that had been ground into flour. So pretty interesting. Long time ago. But let's jump a little bit ahead to sort of the birth of leavened bread. And so this would be around sort of 10,000 BCE with the advent of agriculture and sort of the Fertile Crescent area. Similar kind of area as the Natufians. The Fertile Crescent being I guess that Mesopotamia.
The Tigris, the Euphrates area, exactly. Where agriculture was one of the first places where agriculture was practiced.
Exactly. And if you need sort of a more modern day sort of geographic marker, it'd be like basically where Baghdad, Iraq is. That would be sort of the general area we're talking about, extending kind of over into, maybe Syria and Israel as well, and Jordan. So these grains were ground into flour and mixed with water to create a dough, which was baked then on hot stones or ashes, creating a flat, unleavened bread. Again, we're not really at the stage of baking where it seems leavened bread is at all a thing. This is all very basic. Over time, people discovered that leaving dough out would attract wild yeasts, however, from the air and ferment the sugars, causing it to rise. And so this would actually start to enable the process of rising bread. So up until this point, right around 10,000 BCE. So even if the Natufians back in 14,000, or certainly the people back in 30,000 BCE, or 30,000 years ago, I should say, which I guess would be 28,000 BCE, even if they were making bread, it was not any sort of, rising sort of bread, likely.
One of the things that's fascinating to me is to think about the first groups of people who figured, came upon a wild stand of wheat, for example, and thought, we can eat that. And not only that, but we can do something to it. We can process it in such a way and turn it into something else that we can eat. And so the process of innovating something like bread, I don't think we'll ever really know how that happened, but it's fascinating to think about the generations of individuals of civilization that had to experiment to come up with something like that. And that's, I think, part of the fascination of bread, is that literal culture, in forms of yeast and human effort, are added to this grain in order to produce a new form of food.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to think about the way in which they were transmitting this information across sort of, decades and generations, right? This was all, certainly back then, this was probably all mostly oral history.
For sure.
Being passed down, as, people didn't, write and read, at least nearly as much. So it's really quite incredible that something like leavened bread and the sort of the process that goes into that was able to kind of survive through the generations, being a fairly complicated chemical process, that, again, it completely goes over my head how it works. Of course, I can rely on stuff like Wikipedia to tell me how it works. Let's move up a little bit to sort of the Egyptian influence on bread, just to keep us humming on here. So around 3000 BCE. So again, we're jumping ahead a little bit in time. Egyptians refined the bread making sort of process even more, inventing sort of the first ovens and for more controlled baking, and developing efficient milling methods. And I have here in my notes that Egyptians made a variety of breads that, sometimes by adding honey and oil and spices, and that bread was just so important to ancient Egypt that it was often used as currency and placed in tombs as offering to sort of their respective gods. So obviously Egypt has a huge history with bread, and they sort of innovated a lot on that. And I think we see a lot of sort of what Egypt does sort of carry on over into Rome and Greece and that kind of stuff. Oh, that's a lot of
We've
history.
said a lot already.
Yeah, I know, right? So if you can believe it, we're going to go ahead and do a quick ad break just to give me a little bit of a breather.
And we'll come back with some more history about bread in just a few moments.
And we're back talking about bread and how it's sort of moved through history and sort of the different civilizations that have gravitated towards bread, and sort of the nonlinear sort of status of bread as it sort of popped up in Ethiopia and India and all these other places, sort of independently almost of each other. And there's some connections here and there, but generally. From here, let's go ahead and just continue with our history. Obviously, there's a lot here. And maybe it's a good time to make sort of the qualification that we are not going to cover every single civilization's history with bread. That'd be a lot. So we're trying to pick a few.
It's tough
few
to be
key
exhaustive.
Stories. It really is. So, but I did want to talk a little bit about China, because I don't think China is a place that, if you were to think about China, you would sort of naturally associate it with bread.
Certainly not loaf bread.
Certainly not loaf bread, right? Again, we talked a little bit about, when we were talking about India, we talked a little about rice culture and sort of where rice, maybe kind of comes and sort of dominates the agricultural practices and sort of what that means for bread. China would also be one of these places that gravitates more towards rice. That said, China does have, its own sort of styles of bread. So traditional bread in China is mantou, which is made by steaming or deep frying dough made from wheat flour. And so in northern China and northern central China, mantou is often eaten as sort of an alternative staple to rice. And steamed mantou is similar to Western white bread, but since it's not baked, it doesn't have sort of a brown outer crust, but sort of the same sort of taste and sort of process otherwise.
Okay.
China also happens to be one of the places that has something called millet cultivation in addition to rice. And we're going to talk a little bit about millet as well, but it's sort of an ancient grain. And so before the introduction of wheat, ancient Chinese societies cultivated both millet and rice. Millet is a cereal-based crop, and some of the things that is made from it can resemble bread, but I would argue probably more like crackers,
Okay.
and not something that would be like leavened bread. It'd be more, crunchy, a little bit more, crispy, that kind of thing. Archaeological evidence does indicate that millet was cultivated in China as early as 7,000 to 8,000 BCE. And rice was cultivated in southern China as early as around 5,000 BCE. So as China is starting to get into its own kind of bread-like foods, this would be more with sort of millet than wheat. Wheat doesn't come until a little bit later. So wheat, which does originate in, or at least likely originate in the Middle East, likely
or
didn't
Southwest Asia, if we want to call it that way.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you. Southwest Asia likely didn't reach China until about 2000 to 1500 BCE. And so, again, it's still early. This is still happening, during a time when, a lot of civilizations aren't really talking to each other all that much. Certainly, there's, a lot of transportation gaps in the system. So the early forms of wheat-based food in China were probably unleavened flatbreads or noodles, which is probably not surprising. But China does sort of, pioneer a little bit in sort of the steaming type of cooking of bread, right? We talked a little about that already, but steaming has been a primary cooking method in Chinese cuisine for thousands of years. And many traditional Chinese breads are actually steamed rather than baked. And so, again, if you go to a Chinese restaurant, you can often get sort of a dumpling of some sort that has been steamed, and you can sort of taste and sort of feel how that tastes and sort of the differences that go into it. It's very good. So, for example, mantou is a type of steamed bread that has been eaten in China for centuries. There's also, things such as dumplings and buns. These are all fairly common within sort of the U.S. context of Chinese food. And then finally, there are some baked breads in China today. So leavened bread is less common in traditional Chinese cuisine, although some regional cuisines, such as those of the Uyghur, the Hui people, include this type of bread. So the Uyghurs, those would be in sort of this northwest region of China, far northwest. The influence of other cultures throughout history, particularly in the modern era, has led to sort of the adoption of more Western style breads in China. So obviously, China, like with India, like with much of the world, has its own history with colonization from Europeans, and Europeans obviously bring with them a lot of sort of, the aspects of their, European lifestyle, such as the types of bread they eat. And we covered this a little bit inside our beer episode of, how beer propagates throughout the world, particularly the lager, which is a German style beer, and how it sort of pops up. Similar story with bread, right? So all of a sudden you see sort of with this colonization efforts, these kinds of breads being adopted a little bit by the local cultures as well. And that's basically China. We're going to keep moving along here and keep moving with our history. I think what we're going to do is kind of end our, quote unquote, early history of bread with the Americas. And this is kind of interesting because as we were just talking about colonization, obviously the Americas is going to have a huge, impact with respects to colonization. It's going to be impacted hugely by colonization. So, we jump over to the Americas. This would be inclusive of North and South America and Central America, of course. we're going to divide this into sort of pre-Columbian era and post-Columbian era. So before the arrival of Europeans in this pre-Columbian era, indigenous cultures throughout the Americas cultivated a variety of crops and produced many sort of types of bread-like food. And so much of this was probably derived from maize or what we would call corn today. And so corn at this time was a staple crop for many indigenous cultures in what is now Mexico, Central America, parts of South America and the United States, modern day United States, of course. And people would grind corn into a meal or flour and use it to bake sort of bread-like foods, right? So we would commonly associate corn sort of bread with the food that's now called cornbread, which is really good if you haven't had it. But according to my research, cornbread wasn't actually made during this time. It's just sort of a byproduct of sort of some of these processes that were actually taken by Native Americans and Western African influences, that sort of became common because of the slave trade to create sort of a combined meal that sort of brought in both of these cultures together. And so just some other grains and starches. So different regions cultivated and consumed various other grains and starchy plants. So for example, cultures in the Andean region, this would be sort of the Incan Empire, they cultivated potatoes and quinoa. So quinoa, I can't remember how to pronounce it.
Quinoa. Yeah.
Quinoa, thank you. And so, again, if you go back to sort of our potato episode, you'll learn a lot about sort of how the potatoes sort of, came about during this time in this region. And I think we can keep moving along to sort of maybe the post-Columbian era here. So this was all pre-Columbian. This is sort of the foods that these people were eating, sort of corn, potatoes, quinoa, that kind of stuff. But obviously, as with China, with colonization comes the cultural influences and the types of food that the colonizers were eating. So the arrival of Europeans in the Americas brought significant changes to the kinds of bread that were being produced in the region. So they introduced wheat. And so Spanish colonizers introduced wheat to the Americas, which became a significant crop in many areas, especially what is now Mexico and southwestern United States. And obviously, if we talk about the United States now, it's a huge wheat growing region, right? So we have something called the breadbasket here. That is not native. That is not a native species to this continent.
No, I mean, it's an illustration of how Europeans move around the world and completely transform certain aspects of life. And the association of bread with North America is because of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so I have here that, wheat was used to produce various types of bread, which were, mainly influenced by Spanish and, maybe the English cultures. There's a specific type of bread. It's called bannock. This is a simple type of bread often associated with indigenous cultures in what is now Canada and northern United States. And so this would come from the influence that the Europeans had, but the Native American sort of indigenous tribes sort of were able to create it as their own. And so the recipe for bannock, which is a flat, quick bread, was adapted by Native American tribes from Scottish fur traders' version of the bread. So that's sort of how the indigenous peoples of the Americas, at least one example of how they were able to use the cultural influences of European style breads to sort of make something of their own, in addition to what we talked about with cornbread as well. Oh, okay. So I think with that, because we ran through 4 different kinds of civilizations around the world, we got our geography in for sure.
There's a little bit of flavor from all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this isn't all inclusive. Obviously, Europeans, we talked a little bit about them. They all have their own style of bread. If we talk about, different places in Africa, they're going to have their own style of bread. The indigenous peoples of Australia probably have kinds of bread. All these places probably have some variation of this. This is just sort of, bread is very common at a certain point. But we're going to move on a little bit ahead. There's some, intermixing of sort of, when the Egyptians were making bread and how that might have influenced Greece and Rome as well. But we're just going to leave it all behind. I think broadly, if you want to learn more about the history of bread, there's probably vast tombs of knowledge and history books out there that you can consume. So let's move up to more modern-ish history. And this is where we're going to talk about one of our very favorite subjects, which is the Industrial Revolution. And Hunter, do you want to take us through just sort of what the Industrial Revolution is a little bit?
Well, Industrial Revolution was a period of time where we started mass producing things, right? And so
Right.
this occurs in England first and starts to diffuse to other parts of the world. And whereas many things were made by hand before, we start to integrate machinery into the production of things. And with the rise of that comes the rise of different classes of people. I mean, there were classes of people before, but we get things like managers, right? Like, because everybody loves managers these days, right? Who are telling the workers what to do and this kind of stuff. But it's a transformation that affects rural areas, causes the rise of urban areas, and has a lot to do with mass production. And so agriculture also figures very prominently into industrialization. So agriculture before, in Europe at least, in many parts of Europe, have common lands and those kinds of things, where people were allowed to occupy space. They didn't necessarily have a lot of control of their lives. They had to pay tribute and this kind of thing. But when we get the rise of industrialization, we also get the rise of private property as well. And so that really transforms the way that agriculture and food production works also.
Yeah, exactly. And so prior to the Industrial Revolution, which, really, sort of happens in a couple different waves, between the late 1700s and into the, early mid 1800s. But prior to the Industrial Revolution, bread, everything we've been talking about, all this bread was typically made in small batches, sort of in home or maybe a local bakery, sort of using traditional methods, very kind of labor intensive, as you alluded to at the very beginning of this episode, Hunter, sort of having to knead the bread and sort of punch it and, roll it out. And like, it's very, for lack of a better word, laborious. And so with the Industrial Revolution, you get a lot of mechanization into this process. And so, kind of starts with sort of mechanization of milling. And so the traditional method of milling grain into flour was really labor intensive and inefficient. So the advent of steam and water power during the Industrial Revolution allowed for really the creation of large sort of mechanized mills that could produce a lot of flour more efficiently and consistently. And I think what we're going to find with the Industrial Revolution is not only the speed and the amount of which something could be made, but with which the consistency of product that was able to be made, which bread can be, depending on sort of the right ingredients you're putting in, can be very different, every time you make a loaf of bread. And with industrialization, you're able to get more exact to what's going in that and produce a lot.
Yeah, so there's more standardization in different aspects of industrialization. But then on the flip side of that is that there's a loss of control for individuals who are making things, so that
exactly
things are less customized. But then the control is increasingly in the hands of people who have capital, right? That's the rise of capitalism that goes along with this as well. So that there's the political and the cultural and the economic aspects of bread really start to, have always been part of food creation, but in the Industrial Revolution, we can see that pretty squarely, how those things come together.
Yeah. And this led to a pretty significant decrease in the price of flour. So this makes, making bread more affordable for a large, quantity of people. And if, I do have some flour. I haven't bought it recently, but if I recall correctly, the last time I was in a store, you could buy basically a pound or so of flour for, I want to say like $2 or $3. Like it's not that expensive. Whereas prior to this mechanization of the milling process, this would actually be a pretty expensive relative ingredient that you would need, or you would need to do it yourself.
Well, that's what happens is that, increasingly move away from individual farming and individual subsistence to wheat becoming more of a commodity.
Oh, yeah.
And then being subject to the market and market prices. And that comes with its own challenges for people who want to, eat.
Which happens to be, I would say, most people.
Right.
So with the Industrial Revolution also comes sort of improved transportation, which is also a big factor in sort of the process of bread inside the Industrial Revolution. So advances in transportation, such as the development of railways and steamships, made it possible to transport grains and flours over long distances quickly and cheaply. We've talked a little bit about this concept of the time-space compression theory, which is, as technologies advance sufficiently to a point where, getting from point A to point B takes, half the amount of time, it's this idea that you are now closer a little bit just by way that time is no
Our
longer.
experience of the world is that it's shrinking. It's not actually shrinking, but if you can get places more quickly, you can communicate more quickly. It feels like the world's getting smaller.
Exactly.
But again, that comes at a cost of local control oftentimes. So,
well, exactly. So, with this improved transportation comes, the centralization of milling and baking operations, right? So it made it possible for people in different regions to access a variety of different grains and flours, but that's also taking away from, if you have, let's say, I don't know, Oklahoma was a big, milling and grain sort of producing region at one point. And then, because of industrialization, things are popping up in Ohio, then all of that industry and sort of, might leave and go to Ohio just by nature of, what transportation methods are available or the cost, all these other factors, right? The Industrial Revolution also brought some commercial yeast production. And so the discovery of commercial yeast production of baker's yeast provided a consistent, reliable leavening agent for bread. This wasn't something that really happened before. And this was sort of in contrast to sort of the unpredictable sourdough starters that were, maybe more common prior to this. And then finally, all of this sort of builds to, and this is, for a lot of different industries, but the idea of sort of factories and factory production. So the most significant change was, sort of the shift that we've been talking about this whole time, which was from small scale local bread production to large scale factory production. And there's actually a factory, sort of producing bread here in Portland that I walk by every now and then. And it's kind of neat to see. You can sort of peer in. It's sort of the Hunter, you'll know it says the Franz Bread factory here in Portland. And you can sort of walk by and you can sort of see the loaves of bread sort of shooting out like, every
there's a conveyor belt which, transports English muffins around the factory. And then there's this huge industrial oven that spits out 20 loaves at a time every 30 or 45 seconds. I know this because I was there the other day, sort of mesmerized by the production that was happening there. It's
fascinating. It's very impressive to watch and sort of see how everything has become so mechanized. And obviously the mechanization that we're talking about for the factory here in Portland today is, significantly more advanced than sort of, what was happening during the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. But this all started that process, right?
It's an extension of that.
Yeah, right. Because factory produced bread, it could be made more quickly, more consistently, larger quantities than sort of this concept of artisan bread. And this type of bread was also typically made with refined white flour, which has a longer shelf life and was seen as more desirable than whole grain flours at the time. So this is all, again, happening sort of less, 1800s.
But then less nutritious also.
But also less nutritious, which we're going to talk about as well. And so all of this sort of combines to create this new sort of industry that's sort of cropping up really globally, right? There are, industrial centers around the world that are starting to, sort of agglomerate, within Europe, within the United States, within Canada, within South America. All these places are starting to have the same effect, right? Industrial Revolution, this is not unique to bread. Industrial Revolution does this with countless sort of industries. But one thing that does come out of the Industrial Revolution that might be a little unique to bread is the idea of baking soda and baking powder. And I'm going to turn this over to you in a second, Hunter, to walk us through this, because this gets a little more chemically, and I'm not at all, an expert on either of these. But as I was doing my research, turns out these are not the same thing. I thought they were
not. No, they're not the same. They're both leavening agents, but they're not the same.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I clearly I'm not a baker. But I'm gonna turn this over to you, Hunter. Walk us through what baking soda and baking powder are a little bit.
Okay, so we mentioned they're both leavening agents. Baking soda includes various active ingredients that neutralize the acid and create carbon dioxide gas to make the dough rise. And so certain things that you make, like I made cookies the other day and I used only baking soda. There's
Hmm.
certain recipes that if you're a home baker that you might use both baking soda or baking powder. Baking powder doesn't have acidic ingredients. So baking powder will react with liquid in the recipe and create the gas needed for leavening. And, when you're using baking soda or baking powder, you don't have to necessarily add yeast either. So this is a much quicker way of preparing and baking a loaf of bread or something, or something like a pastry or cookies or something that doesn't involve using yeast. So baking soda apparently has been used over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah,
But
in
as
some
we were
form.
talking about, it's the rise of industrialization that allows that to be put in a box and sold discreetly. Um,
Yeah,
so
I was able to find that again, tracking back to history and to the Egyptians a little bit, that some form of baking soda, which is just sort of a natural deposit that contains large amounts of sodium bicarbonate, was being used, maybe as a cleaning agent or within the mummification process. Now, that's not to say that we know that they were using it for, bread baking as well. They might have. I don't know if we have evidence or not of that, but clearly baking soda, as we know today, it's not new
right.
necessarily. It's new in sort of maybe how it's being used within this context. Yeah.
And so you have certain companies that become known even today for
Oh, yeah.
making some of these products. Arm& Hammer comes to mind, and that's a company that goes back over 150 years or something like that.
Yeah. In fact, when I was originally doing research on baking soda, Arm& Hammer actually has a pretty extensive history of baking soda on their website. And I think naturally because they had a really big hand, I guess, an Arm& Hammer in making and popularizing it. But it was really funny because it was, at certain points, it was like talking about sort of the process of which you should replace it. And it always made very clear that you should replace it with Arm& Hammer brand baking soda.
That's right. And I think with both baking powder and baking soda, the idea is that this is a convenience, right? It's something that makes this whole
Yes.
process go more quickly. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's better than previous ways of preparing things, but it suits the modern world a little bit more. And so people have more control over what's going on. They can create things a little bit more quickly if they still want to make their own food. And then they don't have to grow their own stuff or mill their own things. These are all things that they can go to a store and buy these various components and make baked goods.
Yeah, I think my key takeaway, as we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and sort of the power that industry is maybe taking away from some of the local efforts, is that baking soda and baking powder really maybe inverse the process a little bit, or at least bring sort of local bakers up to a more even level with sort of some of the industrial by making it sort of baking more accessible and more reliable in a lot of ways. And so really, again, I have here in my notes that these substances sort of transformed baking from more of a tedious process that often required hours of waiting dough to rise into a much quicker and more predictable task. So your small time baker who maybe can't doesn't have a factory and can't sort of produce consistency of bread every 10 minutes. Now they're at least able to be on sort of the same level. And I think that's sort of the power of baking soda and baking powder today. But with that, all of this is sort of building to sort of one event or one sort of period of time that we're going to talk about briefly today, but is absolutely a future episode. And that is the Green Revolution, sort of the industrialization of agriculture. And what does that lead to? Hunter, let's talk a little bit about the Green Revolution.
So the Green Revolution is a change in how agriculture was practiced. And it's characterized by the adoption of many new technologies related to selective breeding. And so it began in the 1940s and developed through the 1950s and the 1960s. There is one of the centers for this kind of work was done in Mexico, still headquartered in Mexico City. And this is the Centro Internacional de Mejoramiento de Maíz y Trigo, or the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. And the idea here, this was being motivated by, trying to fight hunger across the globe, particularly in the poorest countries. It's also happening in the context of the Cold War. So it's the idea of providing, sustenance for people, but also to sort of win them over to in the case of the United States, the U.S. sort of capitalistic democratic mode of operating. And so this was done for humanitarian reasons, but it's also done very much for political reasons. There's an analog organization in the Philippines that where the Green Revolution developed different varieties of rice. And one of the other things underlying this is that we've already used a lot of the arable land in the world. So the idea is to make the land that's already got food growing on it to be more productive. And so to be able to have maybe more crops a year or have more food on a particular plant. And one of the other things that characterizes Green Revolution technology is the increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides. And since this is after the 1940s, after petrochemicalization, a lot of these will be derived from petroleum. So petroleum figures very prominently in the Green Revolution. And certainly there's a huge increase in food production that happened, but there's also a lot of critiques that small level farmers in places throughout the world lost a lot of control over their ability to grow food and had to participate in this particular set of technologies. And so we have a scholar activist, scientist Vandana Shiva, for example, from India, who's very critical about what this has done for farmers in India. And it's interesting that India is sometimes also held up as a place where the Green Revolution has been very successful. So I know that we're going to get into this. This is like a really quick sort of cliff notes on the situation. But it's completely transformed agriculture and economies throughout the world and who has control. But it really ties very closely to our situation, because one of the main crops that was experimented with and developed was wheat.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, again, that's super high level. It's absolutely a future episode at some point because it's had such a tremendous impact on the world. So we're not doing its full justice today, but
this is foreshadowing for a fuller episode. There's a lot more to say about it, but just
absolutely.
In the context, just so that we're making sure we have a small segment on what the Green Revolution is when we're talking about food and talking about bread. There it is.
Absolutely. So with that, let's jump to sort of our next ad break, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk a little bit about some specific uses of bread and, cultural and religious and that kind of stuff. So here we go.
We'll be right back.
And we're back. We are about to finish up our first part of the episode on bread and the Geography is Bread episode. But let's talk a little bit more about maybe some specific uses of bread within maybe some religious and cultural contexts. And so this is not exhaustive. We're not going to go through each culture or each religion and sort of detail very deeply what bread means to each of one of these. But I think it's important that we sort of discuss them because, one, religions by their nature are very geographical, as well as cultures are very geographical, right? These are very fundamental geographies that we're talking about. So we'll just run through a few of them here. So Christianity. So in many Christian denominations, bread plays a very central role in sort of this idea of the sacrament of the Holy Communion. I'm not super familiar with the tradition myself, but obviously I know of this just through sort of the popular culture within the United States.
Yes, so it's enormously important in Christian symbolism. Mm-hmm. The Eucharist is a sacrament, mm-hmm. Which is a fundamental part of the religion. The bread, which is taken during communion, is sometimes a symbolic representation of the body of Christ, like in many Protestant faiths. In Catholicism, however, the Eucharist is considered to be the actual manifestation of the body of Christ. And so there's something that happens during the ritual of the Mass, where the priest is able to basically turn bread into the body of Christ. And so this is supposed to be more than symbolic, but in either case, in Christian, in the Christian religion, bread has this really prominent place in this sacrament, which is fundamental to the religion.
Right. Yeah. And so just moving on, to Judaism, right? So in Jewish tradition, bread, particularly challah, plays a significant role.
Challah.
So challah. This is gonna be a bad one for me. So during Shabbat, and other Jewish holidays, 2 loaves of challah are blessed and shared to recall the double portion of manna that fell from heaven when the Israelites wandered in the desert after the exodus from Egypt. So this is sort of an annual tradition. During Passover, leavened bread, chametz, is avoided, and unleavened bread, matzah, is consumed to remember that Israelites' hasty departure from Egypt, leaving no time for their bread to rise. And this was actually a tradition that I got to enjoy for my very first time with some friends this year, and it was very, very cool to be able to take part in that.
There's a phrase, breaking bread together, which I think has its origin and the Judaic tradition, and then is transferred to the Christian tradition. And it symbolizes the idea that sharing bread is at a table is a way of connecting with people and maybe putting aside differences and these kinds of things. So the bread becomes not only part of the celebration, but is symbolizes peace and understanding in a lot of ways as well.
Right. Yeah, and again, just to keep moving on, within Islam, I wasn't able to find any sort of specifics on sort of bread as a central role within Islam. I did find that it could be considered a blessing or maybe a symbol of sustenance within the religion. So maybe just more broadly available there. Of course, I'm also not within the religion myself, so I'm not fully sure. And the same could be said for, maybe Hinduism and Sikhism as well. I was able to find some variations of, sort of how bread is used within these religions, right? So in Hindu rituals, right? So bread or bread-like offerings are often used. But again, this is sort of outside of my sort of knowledge. So I'm a little hesitant to dive too deeply into either of these. But I think broadly, the point here is to make is that bread does feature at least somewhat in all of these different religions. And I think that's pretty natural, right? Bread is such an important part of culture and food, as we've sort of established, especially within history throughout this episode. So with that, let's move over to maybe some fun cultural uses of bread outside of religion, right? So the one I really want to talk about, Hunter, is the pan de muerto, which is a pretty culturally significant bread for Mexico specifically. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, pan de muerto is associated with the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, which is a celebration that has its origin in Mexico and has diffused to different parts of the Americas and different parts of the world. And I think that there's different histories that go along with this, and that I think that this bread is maybe a combination of traditional traditions that were established in the Americas by indigenous people in the Americas, but also combined with some of the traditions that Europeans brought over related to bread and to holidays around this time of year. And so if you go back to the Middle Ages, medieval times in Europe, in Northern Europe and in England, there's a practice called souling that's associated with All Saints and All Souls Day, which is November 1st and 2nd. And individuals would go from door to door and they would receive soul cakes, these baked sort of biscuit type things, and in exchange for saying prayers for the ancestors of the people who'd given the bread. So, pan de muerto is something that is from the Americas, but also apparently includes some of the traditions that Europeans brought over, that the colonial Europeans brought over, and has emerged into something else today. And the bread is often shaped like skulls. There's the symbolism of the living and the dead. This is the time of year It's spiritually in many different traditions where it's the harvest time and where the life of the living and the life of the dead are supposed to be most closely connected. And this is also maybe a good place to plug a future episode where we're going to be talking about geographies of Halloween, geographies of Day of the Dead. And it's a fascinating history or sets of histories that come together to explain the origins of these holidays and what they've become today. And bread has its own role in these holidays as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the pan de muerto is one of the, in my head, most iconic uses of bread within sort of a cultural tradition. And I can think of Dia de los Muertos and like see all of the iconography and all of the imagery that is associated with that. And I have never experienced Dia de los Muertos in Mexico myself, but I still have that. So culturally
I've experienced
prevalent.
it in Guatemala
Mm-hmm.
and in the village of Todos Santos, which is All Saints at the
Mm-hmm.
same day. And I mean, some of the traditions that I think are similar to in Mexico involve, going to cemeteries and bringing offerings of food to leaving them at the graves for ancestors, and this idea of communing
Mm-hmm.
through food with those that have passed on and celebrating the lives of those that have passed on. So it's a very powerful, symbolic role that bread has in this important holiday that connects the life of the living and the past lives of those that have passed on.
Yeah. So just to move on, let's talk a little bit about some other cultural uses of bread. So let's talk a little about the pretzel. And so, I think most people associate here within the United States, the pretzel being this little kind of like cracker-like object, sort of, folds into like a little cross. I think if you go over to maybe, certainly if you buy something into a restaurant, it comes a little bit different. But if you go over to Germany, it's going to be more of a actual bread-like material rather than a hard cracker that's salted. And so pretzels actually have a pretty long history in German baking traditions and are, often pretty integral into sort of festivals such as Oktoberfest, which happens kind of at the same time as Dia de los Muertos, which is sort of around that end of harvest sort of period. And it's said from my research that pretzels were originally shaped, as they are, sort of with the crossing over of sort of the I don't know what you would call them, arms, and they're in order to represent sort of the idea of prayer. And so over time, this is, sort of lost maybe a little bit of that meaning and sort of used as sort of a staple snack associated with sort of, maybe more good luck, prosperity, spiritual wholeness, all this stuff sort of combines in a not dissimilar way from sort of what the Pan de Muertos does for Mexico. And I think with that, I have a couple more here, but I know we're getting a little low on time for our episode today. And I did have a quick game I wanted to play, maybe just to see this episode out, because we've been talking a lot about bread. And so, Hunter, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to throw out a country.
Okay.
And what I want from you is for you to tell me a bread that you might associate with that country. And it can be anything. And if you do have a bread in mind, I would like for you to try and describe it to the best of your ability.
Okay.
If you don't have a bread in mind, that's totally fine. I have a big long list of breads for me to sort of bring in and sort of raise. But I think the whole purpose of us, running through this exercise is to really sort of highlight the wide variety of different types of breads that have come from different communities and sort of what we know about them just being here inside our little pocket in the Pacific Northwest, right? To really show sort of the geographic spread of, cultural breads that don't come from where we are at.
Okay.
So with that said, let's start with Mexico.
Well, we talked about the pan de muerto, but I'd also think of pan dulce, which is more of a pastry, I guess. But pan is bread, so those are things that come to mind immediately, and I think that they're celebration foods.
So more like sweet baked cakes and stuff like that.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I was actually expecting you to give me one that's probably very well known as a bread
tortilla, maybe.
The tortilla.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what I have here in my notes in case you didn't have something off the top of your head. Although I assumed Mexico, you would probably have a bread that you could talk about. But a tortilla, obviously very well known here inside the United States, which is just a thin, unleavened flatbread made from either cornmeal or flour. And is basically a staple in sort of a lot of traditional Mexican foods. In fact, increasingly a lot of American foods as well, right? Even if they're not of Mexican origins, there's still a lot of tortillas floating into a lot of foods that we eat here within the United States and probably Canada as well at this point. Let's move on. So maybe another easy one, but how about France?
I'm thinking of the baguette or the batard, which is like a larger version of that. But the baguette is a small, skinny loaf, very crusty on the outside and light and airy on the inside.
Absolutely. Yeah. So baguette is the top one I have here on my list of countries here, which is exactly how you described it, a long, thin loaf of crusty bread. It's also one of the types of bread that, if you're in France, obviously, very iconic for you to go and buy a baguette. It actually is really delicious. It also happens to be, at least more often than not, in my experiences with actually French bought baguettes, that if you don't eat it pretty soon, that thing will turn into a brick.
Yeah, for sure.
And that has a lot to do with
I mean, the idea is it's supposed to be enjoyed daily. So you get it. It doesn't have preservatives in it, like Wonder Bread. And so you go to the bakery in the morning and you buy a loaf or two, you buy a baguette or two, and you have some from different parts of the day. And then the next day, you do the same thing. And I think it's become I don't know if within France, how symbolic it is. I think it has a certain amount of symbolism, but certainly in the United States, I think it's become symbolic of France to a certain degree.
Oh, absolutely. Baguettes. And I would argue not only baguettes, but croissants as well. Be very emblematic of France. And France, for their part, they're very prideful, very proud of their bread. It's definitely one of the aspects of their culture.
And I mean, in the United States, for a long time, French cuisine was held up as the highest expression of cooking. And, it's not necessarily true today. And of course, it's not necessarily the case at all, because there's fantastic traditions wherever you go in the world. But The Joy of Cooking is a famous cookbook that I think is based on French cuisine. And so French cuisine has a particular status in the United States as well.
Right. Moving on. So this isn't for a specific country, it's more for a region, but let's say Southwest Asia.
Southwest Asia for bread.
You definitely know this bread. There's definitely a very popular bread that comes from this region.
I'm thinking are we thinking of dumplings here? What are we thinking of? What are you thinking of?
So the bread is the pita bread.
Oh, pita bread. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Southwest Asia. Right. I'm sorry. I was thinking of Southeast Asia. For sure. Pita bread. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a type of round pocket bread that's widely consumed in many sort of, at this point, Southwest Asian countries, Mediterranean, and even Balkan cuisines at this point. And it's really known for sort of that, having that pocket and being able to put stuff in it and sort of eat it as sort of a vessel, in a not dissimilar way as a tortilla is used, although obviously a tortilla doesn't have that pocket. Let's just do one more, and I'm sort of torn. Actually, I'm gonna do this one because it's kind of fun and it mixes in a couple different kinds of communities. But let's say Poland.
Poland, I'd be thinking of rye bread. I'd be thinking of pumpernickel or rye bread or something like that.
So pumpernickel is actually from Germany.
Okay,
but obviously, Germany and Poland have a lot of shared history. Especially with regards to the Prussian sort of that sort of kingdom and everything like that. So not entirely wrong. But what I was actually wondering if you would pick up on was the bagel, which is actually from Poland.
Of course.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
The bagel, everybody's favorite sort of breakfast, sort of round bread material, which is
for me the association with bagels is New York.
Is New York, right?
Outside of New York, and that's I know bagels aren't from there, but that's my association.
And it also has a really strong association with the sort of Jewish cultures and
for sure
Jewish cuisines, right? So the product originating in the Jewish communities of Poland has since dispersed out into a wide range of areas, such as places like New York City, where it has become maybe more of an icon for that place rather than its historic roots within Poland. But I thought that was very fun to learn that bagels are actually from, historically from the Polish region and Polish communities of Europe. So there was a lot more. but we're going to sort of end it with that today. I hope that was a fun sort of exercise for you, listener, as we sort of talk a little bit about some of these different cultural icons of bread within various countries. But for now, let's go ahead and run through our pluggables. Hunter?
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. My co-author is David Banis. And of course, I'm co-host with you, Geoff, of the Geography is Everything podcast, which you are listening to right now.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson. You can listen to me right here on Geography is Everything, where I'm also a co-host, but you can find me on YouTube as well. That's youtube.com/geography by Geoff if you're interested in finding some of my videos. If you liked what you heard today, please consider giving us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use, if that option is available to you. We really like seeing those reviews come in. They really help us. But perhaps most importantly, if you like what we do here, be sure to follow us over on our Substack page. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, where there's additional geography content waiting for you. And it's really fun and good community. So please join us over there. Next week, we are going to finish our two-parter on bread, where we're going to talk a lot more about wheat as a commodity and sort of where wheat's coming from, sort of what the global implications are for this industry at large across the world, and sort of the modern day situations that we're starting to see unfold. So should be a really fun one. But until that time, have a good one.
Thanks for listening.